Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today I am very excited to bring you the first of my 5 video series on Roberto Bolaño's 2666. This book has been on my radar for an unbelievably long time, pretty much since the first bits of it were printed, I think in the Paris Review. There was a serialization across a few of the different issues of the Paris Review, but what little bit I read, I became intrigued and kind of stored that away in my memory warehouse, and here I am finally reading it. And I've never read anything by Roberto Bolaño. I've read lots of stuff that references his work, but I've never experienced him directly. And typically, as you know, with like Alexander Theroux and Darkenville's Cat, I'm typically the type who staves off the magnum opus of a writer until later, but with Bolaño it just feels right to go ahead and jump right into 2666, right into the abyss, as he would have it. So that I wouldn't be coming into it out of complete ignorance, I did purchase and read through this compendium of essays, articles, and speeches, collected here in between parentheses by New Directions. This is also translated by Natasha Wimmer, who is the translator here of 2666, so that worked out very nicely. I am doing this reading in tandem with an Instagram account called the Recognitions Book Club, so I'll put the link to that account in the description. Go and follow and join in on the conversation. What we will be doing is here on Leaf by Leaf and over there on the Recognitions Book Club on Instagram, each Sunday we are going to be posting something about that week's reading. And so we're breaking this into 5 because of the 5 books that 2666 is broken into. So there is the part about the critics, which is this video, the part about Amalfitano, the part about fate, the part about the crimes, and the part about Arcimboldi. And this actually brings up a good point that is covered in both the note from the author's heirs and then the note from his literary executor, Ignacio Echeverria. And they talk about how actually Bolaño wished for this to be published as physically 5 different books, and his motives were to provide for his 2 children he was leaving behind. And in his mind, he saw it that having the 5 separate books would accumulate more money than one big back-breaking book. However, and as they explain, like I said, bookending the text itself, they explain that they took the decision to put it all together because when they ran the numbers, it made more sense and would make more money in the long run. Reviewers from around 2008, when the book first came out in English, that I read, said that it was a good idea. Let me know what you think, because even though in their professional opinions it may have made more sense, this brings up a good question about respecting the artist's wishes nonetheless. It's interesting that I also kicked off this year with Robert Musil's The Man Without Qualities, because it is also a famously unfinished and posthumous novel. He died writing the novel, and in the same way, Bolaño died writing this novel. So it's sort of like this is the year of the unfinished big book. There's a great, pretty long and in-depth review from Marcela Valdez in The Nation from 2008, and she says his previous novels memorialized the dead of the 1960s and 1970s. His ambitions for 2666 were greater, to write a post-mortem for the dead of the past, the present, and the future. And there again, this mysterious date, 2666, the only link, as Echeverria tells us, that they can find is over in a previously published short story where this appears on a grave. It doesn't actually appear in the novel itself. Perhaps that was something that was going to be the capstone at the end of it that is now left unfinished. Alright, so this is the first video. This is the part about the critics. The plot, essentially, there's an elusive German writer with a strange name for a German. This is Arcimboldi. He indirectly brings together a quartet of scholars. This is Peltier, a Frenchman, Espinoza, a Spaniard, Morini, an Italian, and Liz Norton, an English woman. And they dedicate themselves to furthering Archimboldi's studies and eventually embark on the search for the real Archimboldi. And this brings this search for the elusive figure that they've dedicated their lives to studying. It brings them in touch with some mysterious figures like Mrs. Bubis and the artist Edwin Johns, who mutilated himself for his art. This is a sort of variation on Van Gogh and his ear. And then a Mexican who goes by the name El Cerdo. I hope I'm pronouncing these properly. It means the pig, which is highly symbolic and referential. And he is apparently Mexico's finest writer and also very high up in government. And then, so El Cerdo brings Norton, Peltier, and Espinoza into touch with Amalfitano, who is a Chilean who is working in Mexico in Santa Teresa, which is Bolaño's fictionalization of Juarez, where of course most people know that 2666 is involved with the horrendous murders that began somewhere, I think, in 1993 and have continued ever since. And I mean, within short spans of time, hundreds of women have been disappearing and turned up dead. So this is a major preoccupation with the novel. But Amalfitano is, again, he's a Chilean professor there at the University of Santa Teresa. And then, on this tip that Archimboldi is there in Santa Teresa. None of them can understand why in the world he is, but nonetheless, just the potential that he is there brings them together. The references to those femicides I was just talking about, they begin sort of offhand and oblique, but then they start taking on more and more prominence once the characters there in Mexico together. And then of course being in Santa Teresa, being in that vicinity, begins to change all of them. And in fact so much so that Norton just clearly makes a run for it. I mean, this book has me right from the start. It's dealing with elusive authors. Thomas Pynchon, Evan Dara, on down the line. And Bolaño even, or the narrator, even brings in the fact that Americans are obsessed with two types of writer, the elusive, mysterious writer and the millionaire, which is really funny. But it's also preoccupied, there are poets and artists and professors running around everywhere. It's just very literary. You're going to get me with that. It's deep in the lives of scholars and students and professors. And at first this is very romanticized. But of course, just as we move from these European metropolises, these very cosmopolitan modern cities in Europe like London and Paris and Madrid, and we move over into Juarez or Santa Teresa, there's this stripping away of the modern screen and the romanticized film that's over everything. Right from the start, in the very first paragraphs, we have the first time that Jean-Claude Peltier read Benno von Archimboldi was Christmas 1980 in Paris when he was 19 years old and studying German literature. I mean, you've got me right there. The opening sweeps me into this romantic time. It's Christmas. It's 1980, which I'm very nostalgic. I wasn't even born in 1980. In Paris, the city of lights, the city of romance. He was 19 years old when he talks about how he was gripped by Archimboldi's work. It really reminded me of my recent experience with Theroux. The form of the novel, at least in this first part, the storytelling is very clear. It's very linear, very engaging. It alternates between characters. In fact, it even uses somewhat what I saw with Robert Musil and his concept of floating perspective. There are some symbolic dreams mixed in. There's this unexpected 4-page long sentence that comes out of nowhere, but it's really well done because it mimetically casts a shadow over the narrative, just as it is introducing a very shadowy figure. One of the things that preoccupies Bolaño that I already picked up on in between parentheses is the concept of the abyss. In his Caracas address, in between parentheses, he says, "So what is top-notch writing? The same thing it's always been. The ability to peer into the darkness, to leap into the void, to know that literature is basically a dangerous undertaking. The ability to sprint along the edge of the precipice, to one side the bottomless abyss, and to the other the faces you love, the smiling faces you love, and books and friends and food. And the ability to accept what you find, even though it may be heavier than the stones over the graves of all dead writers." It is a huge statement. That really hit me hard when I was first reading this, and I started to get a sense of what kind of writer he was and what I was in for with 2666. But it's a powerful statement on the level of writing that he wishes to achieve. In 2666 proper, this is talking about Mrs. Bubis, the old woman who has actually met Arcimboldi. It describes her as a woman who, despite her years, was still as strong-willed as ever. A woman who didn't cling to the edge of the abyss, but plunged into it with curiosity and elegance. A woman who plunged into the abyss sitting down. And so with the two different excerpts there, you can see that this abyss, to actually plunge headlong into the abyss, to go over the precipice, is very important to Bolaño, and certainly that is his way, narratively, of praising this woman. Of course, the famous aphorism from Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, it says, "He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. And if you gaze into the abyss also gazes into you." And there's this really psychologically interesting sequence that happens where Pelletier and Espinosa, who are in a love triangle with Norton, this fourth party, Pritchard, appears, and he intimates that he is Perseus sent to slay the Medusa, whom they take to be Norton. And so then they're worked up about the fact that he's there to do this violence to Liz, and there's also this jealousy that's getting mixed in, and then suddenly, in a rage, Pelletier and Espinosa beat their Pakistani cab driver nearly to death because of all that repressed rage coming out. And sure enough, the things that they yell and say are really shocking for their characters, because here they're supposed to be these civilized, refined European scholars, and yet these things that are coming out, let alone the physical violence, contrast to the two is jarring. So now if we consider that sequence in light of Nietzsche's aphorism, we see that the very violence and monstrosity that they've projected onto Pritchard, that has actually transformed them. Then that violence becomes sexualized in the very next section, and that lays the foundation for the theory that sex and violence are very close to one another in terms of Bolaño's abyss. And if we think about the French term for the ultimate achievement of ecstasy, la petite mort, or the little death, all three things, that abyss and the violence and the eros that's brought into it, they all have their convergence or terminus in oblivion. A repetition of this trope with the taxi driver getting harassed and physically assaulted is repeated. It recurs in Mexico, but this time Norton is a disinterested party and an unknown spectator from high up at her window. And I've noticed this already reading the first two parts of the book. They're repetitions of tropes. We get our first reference to a serial killer by way of the actor Anthony Perkins, who played the fictional Norman Bates in Psycho, which is widely believed to be based on Ed Gein. And that's just one little pearl in a string that ultimately leads to this uneasiness that crowds the novel. There's the idea of empty modernity supplanting idealism. So on one hand, there's a stranger who approaches Morini in the park and complains that the coffee mugs at his factory had become too modern for him, and this has really left him undone. The artist Edwin Johns seemingly sacrificed a part of himself for his work, which of course people love this, and it talks about how the prices shot to the roof and everybody was showing up to buy stuff when they heard about this. But then he confides in Morini that it was only the need for money. And that's a crushing moment for an idealist and a romantic artist. And in fact, those are just two of many confessions that come to Morini, the handicapped Italian professor there in Turin. He almost seems to be a stand-in for a sort of Catholic priest at confessional. Then a gallery owner tells them that his time as a spy was just like anything. It was like that of a Census Bureau worker or even a statistician. And in response, Espinosa, Pelletier, and Norton are saddened. And I think that sadness is because they're experiencing that romantic film being stripped away from their world. This stands in stark contrast to the very opening bit of this part where you've got the 19-year-old Pelletier right at the beginning of his career and completely in love with this new literature he's discovering. And there's so many hopes and dreams, and his future is wide open before him. And then again, another way to think about this is with that geographical shift from the modern cosmopolitan European cities over to Santa Teresa. There's also a meditation going on here with coincidence versus fate, as it's termed in here, sort of, free will versus determinism. And then chaos theory can be brought in here. That artist, the self-mutilating artist, Edwin Johns, he talks about how he has a friend with whom he disagrees. He tells Morini about it, of course, because everybody really tells the things that are deep within them to Morini. John says, the whole world is a coincidence. But his friend apparently said to him that suffering is accumulated, and the greater the suffering, the smaller the coincidence. And Morini questions, as if coincidence were a luxury. And John says coincidence isn't a luxury, it's the flip side of fate and something else besides. My friend believed in humanity, and so he also believed in order, in the ordering of painting and the order of words, since words are what we paint with. And then Johns again says coincidence, on the other hand, is total freedom, our natural destiny. So in other words, his friend believes in art, because what is art but that ordering to chaos? So it gives order to chaos. Now, in chaos theory, there is the well-known butterfly effect, which of course is coming into play all throughout this novel, and it accumulates, like Johns' friend said. Butterfly theory, this is where small changes in one system can produce big effects in another system. But like fractals and fractal theory, the mathematics of chaos, or the mathematics of chaos theory, has shown that even seeming chaos produces patterns. And then still later on, Norton begins to feel that something strange is going on, something unnerving and greater than them is almost like it's moving them to Santa Teresa. Her feelings on this matter, which are so well sketched out here, reminded me of just recently reading Mason and Dixon, Thomas Pynchon's great work. And he brings that out with Mason and Dixon when they go to America. They constantly are thinking back on all the little things that led up to them actually being there, and having this feeling like there's this invisible hand at work. Exile is another topic that occupies Bolaño. Like the Chilean professor in here, Amalfitano, Bolaño also fled Chile in 1973 because of a political coup. Before then he had been in Mexico, and then to Mexico he returned after. And then a few years later he finally settled in Spain, where he was all the way up until his death in 2003. Amalfitano, in this book, he chooses exile, to which Norton replies, exile must be a terrible thing. But Amalfitano retorts that actually exile helps to abolish fate. And from the essay Literature and Exile, in between parentheses, Bolaño says, books are the only homeland for the true writer. Books that may sit on shelves or the memory. And then, and this is great, from the essay Exiles, it says every reader becomes an exile simply by opening a book. To wrap this up, this first part is incredible. This is great writing. He has caused me to feel the sense of dread and uneasiness in Santa Teresa with an intensity that I don't think I've felt since reading Crime and Punishment. I can feel the mounting tension and the heaviness that's in the air there, the paranoia that people are beginning to feel. The nightmarish hotel scene with Norton, which is somewhat repeated later in Marini's flat in Italy, with the two mirrors, is one of the most chilling things I've ever read. Bolaño is an incredible novelist. He has a deft sense of pacing and detail to keep you engaged and to keep you feeling things and keep you in thrall while leading you by the hand to his abyss.